A reading from Luke, chapter 18, verses 1 through 8. Then Jesus told them a parable about their need to pray always and not to lose heart. He said, in a certain city there was a judge who neither feared God nor had the respect for people. In that city there was a widow who kept coming to him and saying, "Grant me justice against my accuser." For a while he refused, but later he said to himself, "Though I have no fear of God and no respect for anyone, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will grant her justice, so that she may not wear me out by continually coming." And the Lord said, "Listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God grant justice to his chosen ones who cry to him day and night? Will he delay long in helping them? I tell you, he will quickly grant justice to them. And yet, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth?"
You know the type. It's a kid who begs, pleads, and is so persistent that you finally cave and get another dog. Or 3 dogs, in my case. Or those who begin their email with, "So sorry to bother you again, following up on the email I sent yesterday and the voicemail I left you this morning." You get the picture. Persistence. This week, we begin a new sermon series exploring the prayer practices of petition, confession, and intercession through a view of God who is relational, responsive, and ever-evolving with us and within all creation. Today, we are beginning with prayers of petition, and our text is from the Gospel of Luke. In it, Jesus tells us about a widow who kept coming to an unjust judge, demanding justice against her opponent. This judge, Jesus says, neither feared God nor had respect for people. But because of the widow's persistence, he finally granted her request, not out of compassion, but simply to get rid of her. Now, some of you may have heard this parable preached as a lesson about persistent prayer. Keep asking God, and eventually God will give you what you want. Petition God enough, and persistence will wear God down, like it wore down the unjust judge. But I think we've missed something crucial in such a surface reading. It's perhaps a comforting idea, but I don't believe that it actually is true, that God works that way. And it could also cause a lot of spiritual harm for folks who have been nothing but persistent in their prayers and faithfulness, only to find or feel that God isn't responding the way they were taught God would if they had only prayed harder or longer. Notice what Jesus says at the beginning of the text. Jesus told them a parable about their need to pray always and not to lose heart. From the get-go, Jesus isn't offering a magic wand or a deal, but a word of encouragement. Keep at it. Take heart. And then he moves into a story about justice and ends with a question about faith. The heart, or cœur in French, stands for courage. And courage fuels persistence. When the heart is brave, it fuels the persistence needed to endure and continue forward. Now, let's imagine this widow. She had no social standing, nothing to back her but her own persistence. We know nothing of her petition to the judge, but that doesn't really matter because she is not seen as someone who matters. She doesn't have a name or a chance, and yet this is why the scriptures remind us over and over to care for the widow, because widows are seen as powerless. But this is also why I love the Gospel of Luke. Luke also uses widows as prophets, speaking God's truth to power. If you read further into the parable and consider the context, you learn that the widow in this story doesn't get justice, yet she becomes a different person through her persistent pursuit. I like to imagine that she moved from victim to advocate, from powerless to powerful, from being silent to finding her own voice. This woman kept showing up, and the very act of continuing to seek justice transformed her, and her transformation became part of the justice she was seeking. But notice something else. The widow just didn't pray for justice. She acted for justice. Day after day, she showed up at the court. She made her case. She refused to be silent. Her persistence was both prayer and action combined. Perhaps this is the origin of the saying, nevertheless, she persisted, which is not all about passive waiting on God to intervene, but a reminder of the call to be an active participant in bringing about the change that we seek. So, is the widow's petition her prayer? Yes. And God isn't the judge in this case, up there, out there, determining if our prayers are worthy enough to respond. God cares about what is in and on our hearts, our deepest needs and struggles. But God isn't up there or out there ranking or deciding which prayers our people are worthy enough to answer. And Lamont treats prayers of petition, her version of help, as one of the three essential prayers of a human life. Her take, especially in her book, Help, Thanks, and Wow, is unsentimental and radically simple. Lamont says that help can be a one-word prayer. No special language is needed. Ragged, desperate, even wordless prayers count. Asking for help begins with admitting that we're not in control and can't fix everything, and that petition is actually less about managing outcomes and more about truth-telling. You may have heard the story of Greta Thunberg, a Swedish teenager who began her climate activism in 2018. After just 15 years old, she started skipping school on Fridays to sit alone outside the Swedish parliament with a handmade sign reading, "School Strike for Climate." For weeks, she sat there by herself, one simple, small figure with a message, seemingly ignored by the world. Most people would have given up after a few weeks of sitting alone, dismissed as just another idealistic teenager. But Greta kept showing up Friday after Friday, and slowly other students began to join her. Then students in other cities, then other countries, and what started as one girl's solitary protest became a global movement involving millions of young people. But here is what struck me most about Greta's story. In interviews, she can often be heard talking about how the act of persistent advocacy changed her. She went from being a quiet, anxious teenager who rarely spoke to becoming one of the most powerful voices of her generation. The persistence itself transformed her from someone who felt powerless about climate change into someone who could address world leaders and inspire millions. Prayer changes us, and I believe prayer also changes God. When thinking of prayer, I think it's helpful to begin by expanding our understanding of God. A mystic once said, God is the circle whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. God's presence permeates all of reality, not distant, but intimately present in each and every moment, every struggle, and certainly felt in every prayer. Prayers are heard and felt by a loving God who cares deeply, but doesn't seek to control or manipulate us or the outcome of situations. Here's what I've come to believe in my own life, as well as in my 27 years as a pastor. serving as a hospital chaplain in a trauma center's emergency room, as a therapist sitting with families as they wait news for their missing loved one, as a pastor who has presided over the funerals of babies, and as a woman who struggled with the highs and lows of trying to conceive a child, and as a child who said goodbye to my own parents in a hospital room way too soon. I don't know a God that unilaterally controls outcomes. I have come to believe that God works persuasively, not coercively, and that no matter how much I pray or what I pray, God cannot force healing or cannot compel love without destroying the freedom that makes love possible. God cannot override human choices without eliminating the very agency that makes us human. And in the midst of it all, the hurts, the hopes, the dreams, and the desires of our hearts, they are all held in the heart of God. Theologian Marjorie Suhaki offers us this understanding of prayer. Prayer, she says, is our openness to God and God's openness to us. In such a case, prayer is not only for our sake, but also for God's sake. Think about that for a moment. Our prayers matter because they add to God's experience. Like the persistent widow who mattered not to the judge or society, she did matter to God, a God who feels our pain, celebrates our joy, and suffers with us. This matters to us too, because when we pray, we're not just asking for things. We're sharing our deepest concerns with a God who genuinely cares, who is genuinely affected by our struggles and our hopes. As Suhaki beautifully states, prayer is God's invitation to us to be willing partners to an intricate dance that brings the whole world into being, one that reflects something of God's character. So we are not just petitioners, we are co-creators with God in the ongoing work of healing and transformation for ourselves and in the world. But what about those times when our prayers seem to hit the ceiling or feel as if they are beaming out to a satellite with no response? What about when we pray with all of our heart and nothing seems to change? Maybe you prayed for a healing that didn't come, or a child that was never to be, or for a job that went to someone else, or for a relationship to be restored that remains broken, or for a loved one to find faith that seems ever more distant from a God that you know and love. We struggle with prayers of petition, don't we? We question whether God plays favorites, and why does it seem like some prayers get answered while others do not? Why does one person's cancer go into remission while another's doesn't? Why does one family's financial crisis resolve and another loses their home? We wonder, am I praying right? Am I praying enough? I have heard all those questions and wondered at times myself the very same things. And yet, I believe that God hears each and every prayer, even when it feels like there's silence. These questions can shake us to our core, but when we can hold an ever-expanding, loving God who feels with us, suffers with us, alongside of our questions, we can see how God works through persuasion, through love, through the slow process of transformation, not through divine manipulation. I am reminded of this time and time again when I get a call to come to the hospital, or when I get a text asking me to pray for a family or a friend. It's natural. It's human. We all want miracles, divine intervention. We want God to override what is happening in our body or in a situation. But it is in these times when our prayers seem to feel worthless or unanswered that perhaps God is present in a different way, like in the peace that came over my mother's face in her final moments, or in the gentle way my dad left the world, and in the same way in which he lived it, simply. Or they come to us in a friend making soup or banana bread, or sending a card that simply says, I am with you. Sometimes the healing we pray for is limited by the nature of disease or circumstance. Sometimes the peace we seek is hindered by human choices that lead to war, violence, and harm that God does not override. Sometimes the justice we demand is delayed by systems and structures that resist change. But here's what's crucial. God's limits do not mean that God is absent or uncaring. They mean that God has chosen to work with us rather than in spite of us. Even when our specific requests aren't granted in the ways we hoped, our prayers still matter. They still change us, and they affect God. They contribute to the ongoing work of healing and transformation in our world. So how then are we to pray and act? How do we live with this understanding that we are genuine co-creators with God? There's not a magic formula, but at the heart of it all, I think prayer is about seeking, trusting, thanking, and opening our hearts to God in a genuine relationship and through dialogue. Fred Craddock, distinguished professor and country preacher, would say that only when we have knocked at the door until our knuckles bleed do we understand what prayer is really about. It's not about getting what we want, he said. It's about becoming who God needs us to be. Maybe you and I can start by praying with honesty and persistence, like the widow in Jesus' parable. We don't have to clean up our prayers or make them more spiritual. God can certainly handle our raw emotions, our desperate pleas, our angry questions. In fact, the most genuine and authentic way to be in relationship is to be honest and real. At least I hope so, because that's mostly what I bring to God. But I've also gathered over the years that prayer without action is incomplete, and action without prayer is simply unsustainable. Sometimes it means just showing up with love, even when it's hard. The civil rights movement understood this deeply. When Dr. King and other leaders organized the Montgomery bus boycott, they didn't just pray for racial justice, they walked. For 381 days, African Americans in Montgomery walked to work. They walked to school and church and wherever they needed to go, rather than to ride a segregated bus. As Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel famously said after marching with Dr. King from Selma to Montgomery, I felt like I was praying with my feet. Their persistent walking became a form of prayer, a refusal to accept God's injustice as God's will. One of my mentors in ministry, Barbara Lundblad, once wrote, "If we pray without seeking justice, our prayers are empty. If we work for justice without prayer, we think it all depends on us. If we pray and work for justice without faith, we will fall to despair when justice isn't done." Perhaps you working at the market feels like a prayer to you when you are sorting food and assisting families in getting what they need. Perhaps a prayer for you is showing up to tutor a child or sitting alongside of a kid in children's ministry, or making a sandwich for our unhoused neighbors, or standing on a street corner at a rally, or accompanying a friend to the doctor's office. Our everyday actions become a prayer, a way of partnering with God in the work of healing and transformation. So does prayer work? Suhaki suggests that our interdependent universe, it's our prayers that create what quantum physicists describe as non-local causation, that they create a positive field of energy around those for whom we pray, enabling them to be more open to God and enabling God to be more creative and effective in shaping our lives and situation. This isn't magic or manipulation. It's recognizing that we live in an interconnected reality where intention, consciousness, and love have real effects. A while ago, I started praying differently for a family member who was testing the Jesus in me, pushing up against nearly everything I knew and loved and believed. Instead of praying for God to fix or change him or his behaviors, I began praying that he would feel surrounded by love and that he would be open to God's wisdom. I went even as far as to make a note in my calendar that appears at a certain time every day of the month that helps me take notice of his transformation. Now, I can't prove this scientifically, but something shifted. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually. He did start opening up, and I did too. I learned more about what he was so passionate about. Was it the prayer that changed that situation? Was it time and natural development? Was it me only seeing what I wanted to believe? I honestly don't know. But I began to see prayer less as asking God to intervene from the outside and more as creating a space for God to work through the relationship and a shared love already present in me and this person. But here's the crucial insight. God works with the world and relationships as they are in order to bring them to where they can be. Prayer opens us in the world to our own transformation. I don't have all the answers about prayer. Honestly, some days I have more questions than when I even started ministry. But here's what I think might be true. The widow in Jesus' parable could have given up after the first rejection, or the fifth, or the 10th, but she kept coming back. Persistence itself was the point, not the eventual justice. Our prayers matter, not because they guarantee specific outcomes, but because they connect us with a God, I believe, who loves us deeply. And something happens when we keep showing up, changing us in the process and changing God because we matter to God. So here's what I'm wondering. If we might try this together. What if we each choose one persistent prayer, one concern that has been on our hearts, and committed to bringing that prayer to God regularly, not demanding a specific outcome, but praying a little differently, staying open to whatever might unfold. If you're praying for justice, maybe you open yourself to ways of being an advocate. If you're praying for peace, maybe ask God to help you be an instrument of peace, even if you don't feel particularly peaceful yourself. The widow kept coming to the judge, believing in what was possible. May we keep showing up and staying open to where God is calling us, how God is changing us to be more of what the world needs and who God needs. We are expanding the heart of God by doing so, not waiting passively for a response, but acting as if we believe what's possible and trusting God, that God is with us and with all in this process, ever evolving. Our takeaways for today are: a prayer is a petition, an honest request, not a demand or a deal. Persistence is not about a passive waiting on God to intervene, but our being active participants engaging with God. And prayer changes us, and prayer also changes God. May it be so.